The weight of grief hung heavy in Mark Stevens' backpack as he wandered deeper into Glacier National Park's wilderness. 6 months ago, his 8-year-old daughter Emma had lost her battle with leukemia, her final wish being for her father to find happiness again. The memory of her small hand placing her treasured bear pendant in his palm still brought fresh tears. Now that same pendant hung around his neck, a constant reminder of promises made to a child who loved animals more than anything in the world. Mark had chosen this solitary photography trip as a way to honor Emma's memory. She had spent countless hospital hours looking at his wildlife photographs, especially the ones of bears, her eyes lighting up as she asked him to describe each animal's story. "Every animal has a heart like ours, Daddy," she would say, her wisdom far beyond her years. Even in her final days, she made him promise to keep taking pictures, to keep telling stories about the animals she would never get to see. The crisp autumn morning had started with purpose, but now the setting sun painted the sky in the same soft orange as Emma's favorite blanket. Mark hadn't planned to stay out this late, but time had slipped away as he photographed the landscape his daughter had only seen in his stories. The growing darkness brought with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very soul, much like the loneliness that had become his constant companion since Emma's passing. His phone's GPS had failed hours ago, and the familiar trails had become a maze of shadows. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, weighed down not just by physical exhaustion, but by the crushing realization that he might break his last promise to his daughter to stay safe and come back with more animal stories. His wife Sarah's morning words echoed in his mind. "Please be careful, Mark. I can't lose you too." The temperature plummeted as night approached, and Mark's situation became increasingly dire. His photographer's vest offered little protection against the bitter wind, and his water had run out an hour ago. But it was the cold that worried him most, its icy fingers reminding him of those sterile hospital rooms where he had felt equally helpless. Emma's pendant pressed against his chest as he stumbled through the gathering darkness. Each labored. Breath created clouds of vapor that disappeared into the night, much like the prayers he had whispered in hospital corridors. The wilderness, which had always been his place of solace, now seemed to close in around him with malevolent intent. What, Mark didn't know as he huddled against the biting wind, was that fate had orchestrated this moment. In his darkest hour, he would experience something that would not only save his life, but would also restore his faith in the connection between all living beings, just as Emma had always believed. Through the gathering darkness, Mark clutched Emma's pendant, his frozen fingers tracing its familiar shape. The sound that reached his ears next made his breath catch. A deep, rumbling breath echoed across the frozen landscape, followed by the unmistakable heavy footfalls of a creature far larger than any human. His years of wildlife photography had trained him to recognize that sound. Grizzly bear, the massive form emerged from the mist like a spirit from one of Emma's favorite bedtime stories. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, the bear's presence commanded the very air around them. Its fur, dark brown with silver tips catching what little light remained, reminded Mark of the stuffed bear that still sat on Emma's untouched bed. His fingers instinctively reached for his camera, but something about this encounter felt different from any he had experienced in his 20 years of wildlife photography. The bear moved with an unexpected grace that seemed at odds with its enormous size. But what truly caught Mark's attention were its eyes. Deep brown, filled with an intelligence that spoke of years roaming these mountains, they held something he had seen before. In those eyes, he recognized the same gentle wisdom he had so often seen in Emma's gaze during her final days. The bear's approach lacked aggression, each step calculated as if approaching a frightened child. As the massive creature drew closer, Mark noticed something that made his heart ache. Along the bear's flank, partly hidden by thick fur, ran a series of old scars. But more noticeable was the way it moved, favoring one side slightly, protecting something. His photographer's eye caught what others might miss. This bear was a mother, and her movements suggested recent loss. The same profound grief he carried seemed to reflect in her careful advances. The cold had begun to shut down Mark's body. His legs, numb from hours of exposure, finally gave out. He collapsed into the snow, expecting the worst. Instead, the bear's response defied everything he knew about these creatures. She moved closer, positioning her massive body to block the bitter wind. The heat radiating from her form created a small pocket of warmth in the freezing night, like a mother shielding her child from harm. Mark's thoughts drifted to Emma's words during their late night hospital conversations. "Animals understand more than people think, Daddy," she would insist, her small face serious beneath the hospital tubes. "They feel love just like we do." As his consciousness wavered between reality and memory, the bear's behavior seemed to validate his daughter's innocent wisdom. The grizzly's protective stance grew more pronounced as the night deepened. Each time Mark's shivering intensified, she would adjust her position, moving closer, her massive form providing more shelter from the elements. Her head would turn periodically, scanning their surroundings with ancient instincts honed by years in the wilderness. But always, she would look back at Mark, as if checking on his condition. In his hypothermic haze, Mark noticed something that brought tears to his eyes. Hanging from the bear's right ear was a small metal tag, catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. It was identical to the ones used in Emma's favorite documentary about rehabilitated bears, the one they had watched together countless times during her hospital stays. This bear had known human kindness before, perhaps during a time of her own vulnerability. As Mark's consciousness began to fade, the bear did something extraordinary. She lowered herself to the ground beside him, close enough that he could feel the rhythm of her breathing. The gesture carried such gentle intention that Mark found himself weeping, not from fear, but from a profound recognition. In this moment, he understood what Emma had always known. Love, protection, and compassion knew no boundaries, not even between species. The night grew darker, but Mark felt a glimmer of hope return to his frozen heart. Whether through divine intervention or the mysterious workings of fate, he had found himself under the protection of a creature who seemed to understand loss and healing as deeply as he did. What he didn't realize was that their shared moment of connection would soon be tested in ways that would challenge both their wills to survive. The first wolf howl shattered the night's stillness, causing Mark's hand to instinctively clutch Emma's pendant. The sound carried through the frozen air like a knife, followed by answering calls that seemed to come from every direction. Through his dimming consciousness, memories of Emma's voice floated back to him. "Even when wolves howl, Daddy, they're talking to their family. Everyone needs family." Blood trickled from the gash in his leg where he had fallen against the frozen rocks, each drop carrying precious warmth away from his body. The wound wasn't deep, but in these temperatures, with predators nearby, it might as well have been a death sentence. The scent of blood would draw the pack closer, turning an already dangerous situation deadly. Mark thought of Sarah at home, probably standing at their window now, watching for headlights that wouldn't come, just as they had done during those long nights at the hospital. His protective bear's reaction to the wolf's presence transformed her entire demeanor. Her massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as she sampled the wind. But what struck Mark most was how she positioned herself even more deliberately between him and the approaching threat. The gesture reminded him painfully of how he had tried to place himself between Emma and her illness, hoping against hope that a father's love could somehow shield his child from pain. Yellow eyes materialized in the darkness, reflecting what little moonlight penetrated the clouds. First 2 pairs, then 5, eventually revealing a pack of 9 wolves. Their approach spoke of experience and coordinated hunting strategies perfected over generations. These weren't opportunistic scavengers, but skilled predators working as a single entity. The pack moved like smoke through the shadows, their grey and black coats blending with the darkness until only their eyes remained visible. The bear's warmth beside Mark had become his lifeline, the only thing keeping the deadly cold at bay. Each time his shivering intensified, she would press closer, her massive form providing both protection and precious heat. The wolves seemed to sense this connection, their hunting strategy focusing on trying to separate them. Their circles grew tighter, each pass testing the bear's resolve and Mark's deteriorating condition. The pack's leader emerged from the shadows, a battle-scarred male whose size rivaled that of the bear. His coat, a mix of silver and black, bore the marks of countless fights. But it was his tactical approach that proved most threatening. Each advance was calculated, aimed at forcing the bear to make a choice between protecting Mark and defending herself. The wolf understood that the bear's protective instinct was both her strength and her vulnerability. Through the fog of his growing hypothermia, Mark watched as the bear made a decision that brought fresh tears to his frozen cheeks. Instead of backing away from the approaching threat, she lowered herself further, practically curling her massive body around his huddled form. The gesture held such profound intention that for a moment, Mark forgot about the wolves entirely. In that moment, he saw what Emma had always tried to tell him about animals. They were capable of choices that transcended mere instinct. The wolf pack's coordination grew more precise as the night deepened. They moved like a single organism, testing different angles, looking for any weakness in the bear's defense. Their haunting howls had transformed into low growls that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. The sound carried ancient messages of threat and territory, but underlying it all was hunger. The brutal winter had made prey scarce, and the pack's desperation was evident in their increasingly bold approaches. The lead wolf's next move revealed their strategy. He feinted toward Mark's injured side, causing the bear to shift her weight to block his approach. In that instant, 3 other wolves darted in from the opposite direction. The bear's roar of defiance echoed through the valley, carrying not just a threat, but a promise of protection that touched something deep in Mark's soul. In her voice, he heard the same fierce love he had felt watching Emma fight her battle, the same unshakable determination to protect what mattered most. As consciousness began to slip away from him, Mark found himself wondering if this was how Emma had felt in her final moments, surrounded by love even as darkness crept in. The bear's heart beat strong against his back, its rhythm somehow matching the tempo of Emma's pendant bouncing against his chest. What happened next would become a testament to the kind of love that Emma had always believed in, the kind that crossed all boundaries nature had drawn. The world narrowed to the sound of 2 heartbeats, Mark's growing weaker with each passing moment, and the bear's strong and steady against his back. Through his fading consciousness, Emma's voice echoed in his mind, clear as the day she had made him promise never to give up. "Sometimes, Daddy," she had whispered during their last night together, "angels come with fur instead of wings." The lead wolf's attack came with frightening suddenness. A blur of silver and black launched through the darkness, aiming for Mark's exposed side. In that same instant, the bear moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her size. Her massive form shifted, not just to block the attack, but to cradle Mark closer, keeping him from the brutal cold of the snow beneath. The tenderness in her protection, even in the midst of violence, brought fresh tears that froze on Mark's cheeks. The impact between bear and wolf sent vibrations through the frozen ground. But what happened next defied natural law. Instead of engaging in the fight, the bear maintained her protective curl around Mark, using her body as a living shield. Each time the wolves struck, she absorbed the attacks without abandoning her position. Blood from fresh wounds stained her fur, yet she remained steadfast, choosing protection over retaliation. Her devotion mirrored Mark's own memories of sleepless nights in hospital chairs, refusing to leave Emma's side even when his own health began to fail. Through the haze of hypothermia, Mark witnessed something extraordinary. The bear began making a sound, not the threatening roar of a predator, but a deep, gentle rumble that vibrated through her entire body. It was the same sound he had heard. Mother bears used to comfort their cubs in distress. The noise seemed to reach into his very soul, carrying the same comfort as Emma's favorite lullaby, the one he had sung during her final hours. The wolf pack's coordinated attacks grew more desperate. As the night wore on, they struck from multiple angles, their teeth finding purchase in the bear's thick fur. Each time they drew blood, the bear's only response was to curl more protectively around Mark, prioritizing his safety above her own defense. Her selfless choice spoke of something beyond animal instinct. It was the kind of love Emma had always insisted existed in nature, pure and unconditional. Mark's thoughts began to drift between past and present. The bear's warm breath against his frozen skin blurred with memories of Emma's gentle touch on his face, wiping away his tears as he tried. to be strong for her. "It's okay to be scared, Daddy," she had told him. "Being brave means protecting others even when you're scared." The bear was living proof of his daughter's wisdom. Blood now matted the bear's fur in several places, yet she never wavered. Each wolf attack was met with the same unwavering dedication to Mark's protection. Her body trembled from the effort and pain, but her heartbeat remained strong against Mark's back, a steady drum of life and hope in the darkness. The wolves' attacks had opened multiple wounds, each one a testament to her sacrifice, each drop of blood a price willingly paid to keep him safe. In a moment of clarity through his hypothermic haze, Mark realized that Emma's pendant had slipped from inside his jacket. It now lay exposed on his chest, the small silver bear catching moonlight and reflecting it like a beacon. The mother bear's eyes fixed on it, and something profound passed between them. Understanding, recognition, a shared knowledge of loss and the power of protection. The lead wolf made one final desperate lunge. This time the bear was forced to respond with more than just defensive movements. Her roar shook snow from nearby trees, carrying in it not just a threat, but a mother's fury at anything threatening what she protected. The sound held the same. Fierce love Mark had felt watching Emma fight her illness, that primal need to shield what you love from harm, even at the cost of your own life. The wolf pack's confidence finally began to waver. Perhaps it was the bear's unflagging protection, or maybe they recognized something in her dedication that spoke to their own pack mentality. The lead wolf was the first to back away, blood staining his silver coat. One by one, the others followed, their retreat marked by respectful distance rather than fear. They had witnessed something that transcended the normal laws of predator and prey. As the wolves melted back into the darkness, the bear's tension slowly eased, but she didn't move from her protective position. Instead, she began gently nosing Mark's face, her warm breath helping to fight off the deadly cold. The gesture carried such maternal concern that Mark found himself weeping openly, his tears freezing before they could fall. In this massive creature's care, he had found what Emma had always tried to teach him. Love knew no boundaries, not species, not time, not even death. The first light of dawn brought with it the distant sound of rescue helicopters, but the bear's protection never wavered. Her wounds from the night's battle had frozen in her fur, each crystallized drop of blood a medal of honor for her sacrifice. Yet her focus remained entirely on Mark, her massive body still curled around him, sharing precious warmth that had kept him alive through the brutal night. Through cracked lips, Mark whispered to her the same words he had spoken to Emma in her final moments. "Thank you for showing me what love really means." The bear's response was to pull him closer, her actions carrying the same gentle intention that had marked every moment of her protection. The pendant around his neck caught the early morning light, and Mark saw fresh tears freeze on his cheeks. As he realized Emma had been right all along, love really did speak every language. The bear's ears twitched at the approaching sound of rescuers, but instead of fleeing, she made a decision that seemed to defy every natural instinct. She stayed, knowing humans were coming, choosing Mark's safety over her own. Her choice reminded him painfully of Emma's last days, how she had tried to comfort him even through her own pain, putting his heartache before her fear. When the rescue team finally crested the ridge, they witnessed a scene that none of their training had prepared them for. A massive grizzly bear, bearing the wounds of battle, cradling a hypothermic man as tenderly as a mother with her child. The bear's eyes met those of the rescuers with an intelligence that stopped them in their tracks. There was no aggression, only a clear message. She had protected him this far, and she would continue to do so. One of the rescuers, an older man named John, seemed to understand. He approached slowly, speaking in soft tones. "We've been tracking her all night," he explained to his stunned colleagues. "She's known in these parts, lost her cubs to a harsh winter last year. But this is something else entirely." His voice cracked with emotion as he witnessed the bear's gentle nuzzling of Mark's face, checking on him one last time. Only when the medical team was within a few feet did the bear finally begin to back away. But even then, she moved with reluctance, her eyes never leaving Mark's form. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, Mark gathered his remaining strength to turn his head, needing one last look at his protector. What he saw would stay with him forever. The bear stood upright, her battle-worn form silhouetted against the rising sun, watching over him until the very end. The helicopter ride was a blur of medical terms and warming blankets, but Mark's thoughts remained with his unlikely guardian angel. The emergency doctor found Emma's pendant, clutched tightly in his frostbitten hand, and tried to remove it to check his vitals. Mark's first words since rescue were a hoarse whisper. "Please. It stays. It brought me 2 angels." Sarah met him at the hospital, her face streaked with tears that matched his own. As the medical team worked to treat his hypothermia and injuries, Mark told her everything. About the bear's protection, about feeling Emma's presence throughout the night, about understanding finally what their daughter had always tried to tell them about the capacity for love in all living things. The news of Mark's survival spread quickly, but it was the story of the bear's protection that captured hearts worldwide. Wildlife experts were amazed, but Mark knew they were missing the real miracle. It wasn't just that a bear had protected a human, it was that in his darkest moment, when all hope seemed lost, love had transcended every natural boundary to bring him home. 3 months after that fateful night, Mark stood at the observation point overlooking the valley where his life had changed forever. Emma's pendant still hung around his neck, but now it was joined by a small metal tag, identical to the one he had seen on his protector's ear. The rangers had given it to him during his recovery, a tangible reminder of the miracle he had experienced. Sarah stood beside him, her hand intertwined with his. Since his return, their shared grief had transformed into something different. Emma's loss still ached, but now they understood what their daughter had tried so hard to teach them. Through the bear's protection, they had witnessed the truth of Emma's words about love knowing no boundaries. The story had touched millions worldwide. Letters poured in from people sharing their own stories of loss, healing, and unexpected connections. A children's hospital in Seattle had invited Mark to share his experience with young patients. There, in rooms much like the ones where Emma had spent her final days, he watched children's eyes light up with hope as he told them about the bear who had proven that love could bridge any gap. The bear herself had become something of a legend. In Glacier National Park, rangers reported that she still patrolled the area where she had found Mark, but something had changed in her too. The profound grief that had marked her movements since losing her cubs had eased. It was as if that night of protection had healed something in her, just as it had in Mark. During his regular visits to the park, Mark would sometimes catch glimpses of her through his camera lens. Each time she would pause and look directly at him, their connection transcending the distance between them. The rangers had named her Emma's Angel, a title that brought fresh tears to Mark's eyes every time he heard it. In his photography studio back home, Mark had created a special wall. At its center hung the last photo he had taken before being rescued, a slightly blurry image captured at dawn of his protector standing guard. Surrounding it were the drawings sent by children from the hospital, each one showing their own interpretation of his story. Below them all sat Emma's favorite stuffed bear, watching over everything just as the real bear had watched over him. "Daddy was right," Mark whispered, reading from one of Emma's journal entries he had found after his return. "Every animal does have a story, but he forgot that every story is about love." The pages, filled with her childhood wisdom, had become his most treasured possession alongside the pendant. The sun began to set over the park, painting the sky in the same colors as that fateful night. Mark took Sarah's hand and held it tight, feeling the warmth that had returned to both their lives. In the distance, a deep, familiar rumble echoed across the valley, his protector's voice calling out as darkness fell. But this time there was no fear in the sound, only a reminder that love in all its forms still roamed these mountains. As they turned to leave, Mark touched the pendant and whispered, "You were right, Emma. Angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they come with fur and scars and hearts big enough to save a broken father." In the gathering dusk, he could have sworn he heard his daughter's laugh carried on the wind, mingling with the sound of the bear's distant call. 2 angels watching over him in their own ways. The story of the bear who saved Mark Stevens would be told for generations, but its deepest truth would always remain in the hearts of those who understood its real message. In our darkest moments, love can come from the most unexpected places, crossing boundaries of species and spirit, proving that the capacity for compassion knows no limits. Just as Emma had always believed, your single subscription today can make a difference in how we understand and protect the incredible animals we share our world with. Every week we bring you touching stories like Mark and Emma's Angel, showing the remarkable bonds possible between humans and wildlife. Please subscribe to hear more heartwarming stories of extraordinary animal encounters.